Book I Believe Because by Batsell, Barrett, Baxter. It's going to be chapter 2. This is a study of the evidence supporting Christian faith. So if you like this, go ahead and click on the like button. And if you want to click subscribe, you'll get first notice of new things we post. We're planning to go through the whole book, and right now we're just on chapter 2. And Batsell, Barrett, Baxter, you can see this is a, oh, I can't see too well. I should probably post something else on there. No, can't do it. Anyway, this book was published in 1971, so it's been out of print for quite some time, but it's a really great book for Christian evidences. Chapter 2, Preliminary Considerations. Near the beginning of this book, it seems right and proper to give an explanation of the stand taken by the author. In some areas of study and investigation, it is possible for a writer to present various possible hypotheses and then leave the reader to choose from among them that which he believes to be the most dependable. In some cases, the author simply provides whatever information he is capable of providing but takes no personal stand. However, considering the matters discussed in this volume, such a position of suspended judgment seems neither praiseworthy nor possible. The very nature of the subjects being discussed makes it imperative that every mature mind draw some conclusions. Life cannot be lived in a state of suspended animation. When one must make moral and ethical decisions daily and almost hourly, it is literally impossible not to take a stand on such fundamental issues as the existence of God, the rightness or wrongness of certain behavior, and the like. When a crisis comes in one's life, he either prays to God or he does not. He cannot remain suspended between the two positions. There is another reason why I feel inclined to take a clear-cut stand on the issues to be discussed in this book. For more than half a century, I've been a careful student on all of these issues. I've read extensively, traveled widely, and become acquainted with some of the world's most outstanding thinkers. I now find myself in the position of guide, especially to young people, but also to many others. Through the opportunities of pulpit, radio, and television, I would be less than responsible were I not to exercise whatever influence I can for the acceptance of those conclusions, which I believe to be most valid. Anything less would be both irresponsible and cowardly. My present convictions are based upon careful thought and study over a period of years. The positions which are taken seem more defensible and more logical than any alternate positions. Having said this, I must also say that it is my intention to keep my mind open to any new evidence that may be forthcoming from any source whatever. The necessity to act requires that a stand be taken. It is also necessary, when one is loyal to his dedication of truth, to be open-minded enough to examine any new evidence which is presented from any source at any time on any subject. To do less is to be afraid of one's position and to deny a real dedication to the search for the truth. Neither of these positions do I wish to embrace. Most of us are quite familiar with the scales of justice, which are made up of a crossbeam to which are attached two pans with the possibility of either pan being weighted more heavily than the other. Such a scale is a device for comparing the relative weights of different objects. With this simple illustration, I believe that it is possible to demonstrate that the side of faith is heavier on the two sides of each of the major issues to be discussed in this book. I also believe that this is all that can justly be required. Either there is a God or there is not. There can be no in between. If the evidence supporting the idea of the existence of God is more convincing than the evidence that raises questions and problems about its existence, then the fair-minded reasoner must decide for faith in God. All that is required is that faith be demonstrated to be more reasonable than non-faith. L.S. Kaiser once wrote, "Let us remember this fact. Human reason cannot prove the Christian religion to be true. It can only show it to be more reasonable than unbelief." Many years earlier, Harvey Everest had written, "We cannot believe unless belief is more rational than unbelief. We cannot believe at will, arbitrarily, or against reason. Reason, meaning thereby the whole mental power or the ascertainment of truth, must be our guide. No one insists upon this more earnestly than the defender of Christianity. Reason and faith are not antagonistic, but rather coadjutors. No faith is worthy unless it is justified by the severest use of reason. It seems appropriate at this point to state the fundamental thesis of this book. There is an infinite, all-wise, all-powerful, all-loving God who has revealed himself by means natural and supernatural in creation, in the nature of man, in the history of Israel and the church, in the pages of Holy Scripture, in the incarnation of God in Christ, and in the heart of the believer by the gospel. It shall be our purpose to demonstrate the reasonableness of the various facets of this position. This is our stand. Preliminary observations. In a world such as ours, it is obvious that each of us must at times take what may be called the leap of faith in connection with our convictions. We do this without embarrassment, for we know that almost every aspect of life requires this same kind of leap of faith. For example, there's a great amount of faith involved in beginning the long, tedious, burdensome program of education. No freshman can possibly know that he will ultimately be successful in finishing high school or college. He begins the long series of studies by faith. Eating at a restaurant requires faith, for it is quite possible that in some unnoticed way the food may have become contaminated and therefore be dangerous to one's health. Having a prescription filled at a drugstore likewise requires a certain amount of trust. Similarly, driving a car along a modern highway, riding in an airplane, or even walking along a street requires a certain amount of faith. In still a different way, reading a newspaper requires faith. Buying a house or entering into marriage or any other major decision of life also involves great faith. So in religion too, it is reasonable to expect some necessity of faith. Religion certainly does not stand alone in this regard. We might also do well to observe that absolute, dogmatic, unequivocal evidence is often not possible in a given situation. However, it is often possible in such situations to demonstrate a strong presumption of truth. There are some situations, by their very nature, which make it impossible to line up all the evidence on one side of a question. Few things are 100% versus 0%. In long years of observing and judging college debates, there was never a time when I felt that one team had 100% of the merits and the other team had 0%. Always it was a matter of 60-40, excuse me, or 55-45, excuse me. Always it was a matter of 60-40, or 55-45, or 70-30, or some other similar balance. In studying the issues, it will seldom be possible to show all of the evidence on either side of a question. But we believe that the heavier side of the evidence can be shown to be on the side of the Christian faith. For many years, it has been my observation that the entire burden of proof is often forced upon those who believe the Christian religion by those who question it. Often the atheist or agnostic does not shoulder the share of the burden of proof. He asks a barrage of questions, but does not prove his own position. It is easy to ask questions. It is much harder to demonstrate evidence. It is much harder to demonstrate evidence. Let us begin our study by requiring the positions of faith and non-faith to accept equal responsibility to produce evidence. We note further that proof takes place in the mind, and the mind may be closed. Evidence does not necessarily prove. It constitutes proof only when the mind is open and honestly considers the evidence. Perhaps you're familiar with the story of the two boys who had a contest to see which one could scare the largest number of rats out from under the barn. The first boy placed his friend on the opposite side of the barn, took a long pole, and rattled it loudly beneath the barn. Rats scattered in every direction. The first boy called to his friend, "Did you see any rats?" The answer came back, "No, not one." How was that possible? There had been more rats running in every direction than one could count, visible to anyone who would look. The first boy went around the barn to see why his friend had seen no rats, only to find him with his eyes tightly closed. He had seen no rats, not because there were no rats to see, but because his eyes were closed. Sometimes the evidence for the Christian religion is ineffective because the mind has been closed. Homer Haley pointed out that the acceptance of evidence depends on 5 things. 1, the weight of the evidence. 2, the clarity by which the evidence is presented. 3, the honesty of the examiner of the evidence, that is, the hearer. 4, the logical ability of the hearer to evaluate evidence. The background prejudices. The background, number 5, the background prejudices of the hearer. In our study, we shall not settle all problems or answer all questions, but we confidently believe that we shall be able to settle and answer many. We believe that we shall leave the field of discussion with fewer problems and questions than those who deny the existence of God and his creation of the universe. All that we ask is an open, fair examination of the evidence. In the preliminary analysis of this whole field of study, it is also well for us to distinguish between the words hypothesis, theory, and fact or law. A hypothesis is a preliminary idea about how something may function. It is an intelligent guess, not yet supported by significant evidence. It has not yet been demonstrated in the full absolute sense, but there is some supporting evidence to cause it to be given greater credence than the original hypothesis. Then there is fact or law. This is a theory that has been demonstrated over and over again and has therefore been accepted generally as a basic law of nature. It is capable of verification by competent scientists. Excuse. There are other preliminary observations. For example, sometimes people who have taken something for granted without question are disturbed when they are introduced to problems concerning what they have previously believed. As one example, we might mention the age of the earth. There are some who have long believed certain explanations that they find any divergent evidence disturbing. There are some who have so long believed certain explanations that they find any divergent evidence disturbing. It is our conviction that in the long run, it is better to face the problem, find the evidence, and then know the truth concerning the matter. To remain in ignorance, even though one may be fully satisfied in one's ignorance, is hardly a defensible position. We ought to be ready for any truth that can actually be demonstrated to be truth. Finally, it must be pointed out that when a young person faces a question for which he does not know an answer, he is likely to feel that there is no answer. Not knowing the answer, he concludes that no one knows an answer or that there is no answer. This has led many a young person to abandon various aspects of the religious faith. Unnecessarily, if he had been better informed, he would have been overwhelmed by some problem or question. If he had been better informed, he would not have been overwhelmed by some problem or question. It does not necessarily follow that when a young person does not know an answer or the answer to a question, there is no answer. Scope of Christian evidences. The scope of Christian evidences is pointed out by Bernard Ramm, an excerpt, quote, that of demonstrating that Christianity is the religion which pertains to reality by reasons of its factuality. The focus is upon the factuality. By fact, we mean either some objective thing, such as an archaeological dig or artifact, or some event, such as an historical battle, or some phenomenon which may be personal, that is, in the case of Paul's conversion, or social, as in the spread of the Christian church. These facts may be classified three ways. First, there is a material fact. By material fact, we refer to anything of a very concrete, specific nature. For example, things, historical events, meteorological phenomena, documents, or monuments. Secondly, there is supernatural fact, that which involves events or phenomena which can only be satisfactorily accounted for by invoking the category of the supernatural. Thirdly, there is experiential fact, which refers to the experience of people, and social phenomena, which are traceable back to the impact of the Christian religion. There is a rather concrete statement, end quote, by the way. This is a rather concrete statement of the areas in which we may expect to find evidence to use in our discussions of the various facets of the Christian faith. Robert Morris Page has pointed out some of our limitations in making observations. In reasoning concerning such matters as the existence of God, we must recognize our own limited perspective. For example, when ships are built of wood, everyone would have considered it ridiculous to think that iron could float. A blacksmith would immediately demonstrate the impossibility of iron floating by putting a horseshoe in a tub of water and watching it sink. However, if he had only had the insight to do so, he could have demonstrated the truthfulness of the opposite by putting a wash basin in his tub of water, thus anticipating the eventual discovery that iron ships could float. Page then pointed out sometimes a full test of a hypothesis requires observations that are not available to a particular observer. For example, suppose an observer is limited to his observation to the surface of the ocean. This observer can see nothing that is above or below the surface of the water. Page added that while the observer is aware of the boats and other things floating on the water, he knows nothing at all about submarines and fish swimming below the water, or about birds and airplanes flying above the water. Think how incredible it would be to him to hear the testimony of someone who could observe above and beneath the water. His own limited perspective would make such information seem unbelievable. Since our powers of observation are limited to a relatively small portion of our reality, we must be slow to question such things as the existence of God. But with open minds, we are now ready to examine evidence of whatever kind and from whatever source as it relates to the idea of God in the universe. With some awareness of our own limited perspective and of man's tendency to see what he wants to see, we set out in search for truth cautiously and humbly, yet guided by the principles of logical reasoning and with an awareness of the methods of modern science. We set out with the high hope of discovering truth. That's the end of chapter 2. So if you've liked that, and I hope you have, we'll hope to get chapter 3 out here soon. And of course, we have chapter 1 out there. But if you like it, wouldn't mind you clicking a like. It'll help me up my stats on this channel I'm trying to build. And also subscribe. We'll do the same thing. If you want to comment, I have comments on. Hopefully, I'll be able to keep that going. If you want to show that you stayed to the very end of this, you can just start out with C2, which is chapter 2. And I'll be sure to answer anything you have right off the bat. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.